The autumn wind carried the scent of burning leaves through Maple Ridge as Daniel McCarthy pulled his weathered pickup truck onto Elm Street. Golden hour light filtered through the bare oak branches, casting long shadows across the modest two-story houses that lined the quiet residential street. For 3 months now, he'd made this same drive every evening at exactly 6:30, delivering dinner from Rosa's Italian kitchen to 412 Elm Street. Daniel parked behind the white picket fence and grabbed the familiar brown bag from the passenger seat, chicken parmesan with garlic bread, the same order every single night. The delivery instructions were always the same too. Leave on porch, ring doorbell once, wait in truck until door closes. He'd grown curious about the person who lived behind that glowing porch light. But the rules were clear, and Daniel needed this job. At 34, his construction foreman days were behind him, ended by a workplace injury that left him with a permanent limp and mounting medical bills. The divorce had followed 6 months later. Sarah couldn't handle being married to a man who came home exhausted from delivering food instead of building houses. Now, alone in his cramped apartment above the hardware store, Daniel found solace in the routine of his evening deliveries. Tonight felt different, though. As he approached the front steps, the door opened before he could ring the bell. Margaret Patterson appeared in the doorway, and Daniel's breath caught. She was nothing like he'd imagined. Striking brunette hair framed a face marked by exhaustion, her green eyes holding depths of sadness he recognized from his own mirror. She wore a simple navy cardigan over jeans, but there was something fragile about her, like someone still recovering from a long illness. "You're earlier than usual," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight tremor that made Daniel want to step closer. "Traffic was light tonight," he replied, struck by how her presence filled the doorway despite her apparent frailness. "You doing okay, ma'am?" Their eyes met for a brief moment, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or the understanding that comes between two people who've both known loss. Daniel found himself studying her face, noting the way she gripped the doorframe as if needing its support. Maggie hesitated, then whispered, I haven't talked to anyone in person for months. Thank you for being so reliable." As she reached for the bag, her hand brushed his, and Daniel noticed her wedding ring was missing its center stone, just an empty gold setting that caught the porch light. Behind her, a framed photograph on the hallway table showed her with a man in military uniform. But the glass was cracked down the middle, splitting their faces apart. The next evening, Daniel arrived at Rosa's Italian kitchen 20 minutes early, hoping to learn more about the mysterious woman on Elm Street. The restaurant buzzed with the dinner crowd, red-checkered tablecloths and warm lighting creating the kind of atmosphere that made everyone feel like family. Rosa Castellano, the 60-year-old owner with silver-streaked hair and flour-dusted hands, noticed him immediately. "Danny, you're early tonight," she called from behind the counter, her thick Brooklyn accent cutting through the dinner conversation. "Your usual pickup isn't ready yet." "No rush." "Rosa, just thought I'd grab a coffee while I wait." Rosa studied his face with the keen eye of someone who'd spent decades reading people across restaurant tables. She wiped her hands on her apron and gestured for him to follow her to the back booth, away from the other customers. "Danny, I need to tell you something about that Patterson girl." Rosa's voice dropped to a whisper, her weathered hands folding on the table between them. "She's been ordering the same meal every night since her husband." Rosa paused, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Tommy Patterson died in Afghanistan 8 months ago. Poor thing hasn't left that house since the funeral. Doctor says she's got that, what do you call it, agoraphobia." Daniel's chest tightened as the pieces fell into place. The delivery instructions suddenly made perfect sense. Not rudeness or antisocial behavior, but fear. Pure, paralyzing fear of the world outside her front door. "Her mother-in-law, Diane Patterson, pays for the meals," Rosa continued, her voice taking on a gossipy edge. "Says it's the only way to make sure Maggie eats something besides crackers and whatever she's got in that pantry. But between you and me, I think that woman's got other plans for poor Maggie." "What kind of plans?" Daniel asked, though something in Rosa's tone already told him he wouldn't like the answer. Rosa leaned closer, her voice barely audible above the restaurant noise. Word around town is that Diane's been talking to lawyers about having Maggie declared, not capable of taking care of herself. Says grief has made her lose touch with reality. Rosa handed Daniel the usual order. But tonight, there was something different. A folded piece of paper tucked under the aluminum container. Barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Maggie slipped this to my delivery boy yesterday, but he quit this morning. Found a better job at the factory. She specifically asked for you to get it. Rosa's eyes twinkled with something between mischief and concern. Whatever that girl wrote, she's been waiting all day for you to see it. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he realized Maggie had been trying to reach out, not to just anyone, but to him specifically. The woman who couldn't leave her house had found a way to send a message to the outside world, and she'd chosen him as her messenger, outside in his truck, parked under the streetlight on Main Street. Daniel unfolded the paper with careful fingers. The distant sounds of high school football practice drifted from the field behind the school, mixing with the evening sounds of a small town, settling into darkness. Maggie's handwriting was neat but hurried, as if she'd written it quickly before losing her nerve. To the delivery driver with the kind eyes, I know this is strange, but you're the only person I see anymore. Would it be too much to ask if you could stay for just a minute when you deliver tonight? I promise I'm not dangerous, just lonely. Daniel stared at the words, his heart racing with an emotion he hadn't felt in months. His own isolation since the injury and divorce came flooding back. The empty apartment, the silent evenings, the constant worry about making ends meet on delivery wages. But something about Maggie's vulnerability called to him, awakened a protective instinct he'd thought Sarah had killed. He drove to Elm Street rehearsing what he might say, how he could make this less awkward for both of them. As he approached 412, he noticed the porch light flickering like a firefly against the growing darkness. When he rang the doorbell, the door opened immediately. She'd been waiting, probably watching from the window. You got my note, Maggie said, relief flooding her voice like water breaking through a dam. Yeah, I did. Daniel shifted the food bag to one arm, his other hand unconsciously smoothing down his shirt. I've got a few minutes, if you'd like. As Maggie stepped aside to let him onto the porch, a black sedan pulled up across the street with deliberate slowness. The driver didn't get out, but sat behind the wheel, clearly watching the house. Daniel could feel eyes on them, even through the car's tinted windows. Maggie's face went pale as moonlight. She's having me watched, she whispered, her voice barely audible. My mother-in-law. She thinks I'm losing my mind, and if she can prove it. She didn't finish the sentence, but Daniel saw pure terror in her green eyes, not the manageable fear of someone dealing with anxiety, but the desperate panic of someone fighting for their freedom. Daniel glanced at the sedan one more time, then made a decision that would change everything. Why don't we go inside? The living room felt like stepping into a shrine. Military commendations hung in perfect rows on the walls, their gold frames catching the soft lamplight. Tommy's reading glasses still sat on the side table next to an unfinished crossword puzzle, and his coffee mug, with a faded Marine Corps logo, remained exactly where he'd left it 8 months ago. The house was meticulously clean, but it felt frozen in time, as if Maggie had been afraid to disturb even the smallest detail of her husband's presence. Maggie moved around the room like a nervous bird, wringing her hands and straightening things that were already perfectly straight. I know what people say about me, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The crazy widow who won't leave her house. But after Tommy died, everything outside felt dangerous, overwhelming. Like the world had become this huge, terrifying place that would swallow me whole if I stepped into it. Daniel set the food bag on the coffee table, noting how she flinched slightly when he moved too quickly. There's nothing wrong with taking time to heal. Try telling that to Diane Patterson. Maggie's voice took on a bitter edge he hadn't heard before. She wants me declared mentally incompetent so she can sell this house and move me into some facility upstate. Says I'm dishonoring Tommy's memory by wallowing in self-pity instead of moving forward with dignity. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Daniel could see the weight of them in Maggie's shoulders, the way she seemed to shrink into herself with each harsh syllable her mother-in-law had spoken. "This house is the only place I feel safe," Maggie continued, sinking into Tommy's favorite armchair. "It still smells like him. His aftershave, the coffee he drank every morning. Out there," she gestured toward the window where the sedan still waited. "Out there, everything reminds me that he's gone forever." The front door suddenly swung open without warning, the sound echoing through the quiet house like a gunshot. Diane Patterson strode in using her key, a stern woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail for future use against them. "Margaret, who is this man?" Diane's voice cut through the room with military precision. "I specifically told you that having strangers in this house was inappropriate for someone in your condition." She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Daniel sitting on the couch, her eyes narrowing dangerously as she took in his work clothes and the food container on the table. "I'm calling Dr. Hendricks immediately. This proves you're not capable of making rational decisions about your own welfare." The next morning, Daniel stopped by Miller's hardware store to pick up supplies for the odd jobs he took to supplement his delivery income. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and he noticed how the conversation around the coffee pot stopped abruptly. Bill Miller, the store owner with paint-stained fingers and kind eyes, stood with Frank Kowalski, the town's retired police chief whose grey mustache couldn't hide his suspicious expression, and Jim Valdez, who worked at the bank and always looked like he knew everyone's business. "Heard you were at the Patterson widow's place last night," Frank said, his tone carefully neutral, but his posture suggesting an interrogation was about to begin. His hand rested casually on his belt, a habit from 30 years of police work that he'd never quite shaken. "Just delivering food," Daniel replied, grabbing a box of screws from the shelf and trying to keep his voice steady. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating harsh shadows that made everything feel more serious than it should have been. "Diane Patterson's been telling folks that Maggie's entertaining men now," Bill said, shaking his head with the disappointment of someone who'd watched too many good people fall from grace. "Says it proves she's not right in the head anymore. Real shame what grief can do to a person, especially a young woman like that." Jim leaned forward conspirationally, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than if he'd shouted. "Word is, Diane's got a buyer lined up for that house already. Prime real estate on Elm Street worth twice what Tommy paid for it. If Maggie gets committed to that facility upstate," he let the implication hang in the air like morning fog. Frank Kowalski stepped closer to Daniel, his retired cop instincts clearly still sharp as a blade. "Son, I'd be real careful if I were you. Diane Patterson's got connections all over this county. Her late husband was a judge, and she sits on half the charity boards in town. She's already filed a petition with Judge Morrison about Maggie's mental state." Frank's voice dropped to a gravelly whisper. Any man seen taking advantage of a grieving widow could find himself facing some serious legal trouble, the kind that follows you around for years. Daniel felt the walls of the small town closing in around him like a trap he hadn't seen coming. What had started as a simple act of kindness, staying to talk with a lonely woman, was being twisted into something dark and predatory by people who'd never bothered to look past the surface of Maggie's pain. That afternoon, Daniel arrived at Rosa's Italian kitchen to find the owner looking more worried than he'd ever seen her. Rosa wiped her hands on her apron repeatedly, a nervous gesture that told him something serious had happened. The restaurant was empty, except for the lingering smell of garlic and tomatoes, creating an intimacy that made their conversation feel like a confession. "Danny, sit down," Rosa said, pulling him toward the back booth where they'd talked the night before. "Diane Patterson was here an hour ago with that lawyer of hers. Stevens, I think his name is. Slick-looking man in an expensive suit who asked too many questions and took notes on everything I said. Daniel's stomach dropped like a stone into deep water. What kind of questions? About you and Maggie, how long you've been delivering to her house, whether I've seen anything inappropriate in your behavior, if I thought you might be taking advantage of her vulnerable emotional state. Rosa's voice took on a mocking tone as she repeated the lawyer's formal language. They wanted to know if I'd noticed any changes in Maggie's behavior since you started spending time with her. Rosa reached under the counter and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the table like evidence in a criminal trial. But Danny, that's not the worst part. They had photographs. Daniel opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were black and white images, clearly taken with a telephoto lens. Him on Maggie's porch the night before, the two of them visible through the living room window, him carrying the food inside. The photos were grainy, but unmistakably damning when viewed through the lens of Diane's narrative. They're building a case, Rosa continued, her voice heavy with the weight of someone who'd seen too much of human nature's darker side. Making it look like you're some kind of predator preying on a mentally unstable woman. Rosa slid a newspaper across the table, the Maple Ridge Gazette, still smelling of fresh ink. The headline read, "Local Widows Isolation Concerns Family," and the article, written by someone named Jennifer Walsh, painted Maggie as a mentally unstable recluse whose behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. It hinted at questionable associations and concerning changes in judgment, without ever naming Daniel directly. But anyone in town would know exactly who they meant. The restaurant door chimed, and Dr. Elizabeth Hendricks walked in with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to being in charge. She was a professional woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She carried a leather briefcase and wore the kind of expression that suggested she dealt with difficult conversations for a living. "Mr. McCarthy?" she said, approaching their table with the confidence of someone who already knew the answer. "I'm Dr. Hendricks, Maggie Patterson's psychiatrist. I need to speak with you about your relationship." With my patient, she set her briefcase on the table with a soft thud that somehow sounded like a judge's gavel. "What you're doing could undo months of careful progress and put her in real psychological danger." Despite Dr. Hendricks's stern warning echoing in his mind, Daniel couldn't stay away from Elm Street that evening. Rain patted against his truck's windshield as he pulled up to 412, the familiar porch light creating a warm beacon in the darkness. Something felt different tonight. The house seemed smaller, more fragile, against the storm clouds gathering overhead. When Maggie opened the door, Daniel's heart clenched. She'd been crying, her green eyes rimmed with red, and her hands shook as she gestured for him to come inside. The living room felt different too, charged with a desperate energy that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. "Diane came by this afternoon with papers," Maggie said, her voice hollow as an empty grave. She moved to the kitchen table where legal documents lay scattered like fallen leaves. "Commitment papers. She says if I don't sign over power of attorney willingly by Friday, she'll have me declared incompetent and force the issue in court." Daniel sat across from her at the small kitchen table, the soft lamplight creating intimate shadows that made their conversation feel like a confession. "We need to fight this. There has to be something we can do." "With what?" Maggie laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the quiet kitchen like broken glass. "I haven't worked since Tommy died. I haven't left this house in 8 months. I have panic attacks if I even think about going to the grocery store or the bank. How does that look to a judge who's probably known Diane Patterson for 20 years? She stood abruptly and walked to a wooden box on the counter, polished mahogany with brass corners, clearly something precious. From inside, she pulled out a letter written on military stationery. The paper slightly yellowed with age and folded with the careful precision of someone who'd read it 100 times. "I never told anyone about this," she whispered, her voice breaking like ice on a winter pond. Not Dr. Hendricks, not Diane, not anyone who came to the funeral with their casseroles and their sympathy cards. Tommy wrote this letter before his last patrol. But I only found it last week when I finally worked up the courage to go through his personal effects. Maggie handed Daniel the letter with shaking hands. And as he read, his face went pale as moonlight. The letter revealed something that changed everything they thought they knew about Diane's motivations. Tommy had discovered that his mother had been stealing money from the military family's support fund she managed, skimming from donations meant for widows and children, falsifying records and covering her tracks with the skill of someone who'd been doing it for years. "If something happens to me, Maggie," the letter concluded in Tommy's familiar handwriting, "don't let my mother near our house or our finances. She's not the grieving mother-in-law she pretends to be. She's a thief who's been stealing from the families of fallen soldiers, and I was going to expose her when I came home. Keep this letter safe. It might be the only proof anyone ever finds." Later that same evening, Daniel and Maggie sat in her living room with Tommy's letter between them on the coffee table. The weight of his revelation settled over them like fog, changing the shape of everything they thought they understood about Diane's sudden interest in Maggie's mental health. "She doesn't want me committed because she cares about my well-being," Maggie realized aloud, her voice filled with the bitter clarity of someone seeing the truth for the first time. "She wants me out of the way so she can sell this house and disappear with whatever money she's got left before anyone discovers what she's been doing with the support fund." Daniel pulled out his phone, his finger hovering over the emergency number. "We need to call the police right now, show them this letter and let them handle the investigation." "With what proof beyond Tommy's word?" Maggie shook her head sadly. "He's been dead for 8 months, Daniel. Any evidence would be long gone by now, shredded, burned, or buried so deep that no one will ever find it. And who's going to believe the crazy widow who won't leave her house over Diane Patterson, pillar of the community and grieving mother?" They sat in heavy silence, the impossibility of their situation sinking in like stones thrown into deep water. Outside, the black sedan had returned to its usual spot across the street, and through the rain-streaked windows they could see the glow of a cigarette in the darkness. "There might be one way," Maggie said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it would mean—" She looked at Daniel with desperate, frightened eyes. "It would mean I'd have to leave this house, face the world again, go to the police station, maybe even testify in court if it comes to that. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to do any of those things." The lights suddenly went out, plunging the entire street into darkness. Through the front window, they could see that it wasn't just Maggie's house. The whole block had lost power. But as their eyes adjusted, Daniel noticed something that made his blood run cold. Flashlight beams were moving around the outside of the house, methodical and purposeful, like someone conducting a search. "She's not waiting until Friday," Maggie whispered in terror, grabbing Daniel's arm so tightly he could feel her nails through his shirt sleeve. "Diane's making her move tonight." The sound of someone trying the back door handle echoed through the house like a death knell, followed by the deliberate scrape of metal on metal, someone working on the lock with professional tools. Daniel helped Maggie gather Tommy's personal documents and the crucial letter, stuffing them into a canvas bag with hands that shook despite his best efforts to stay calm. Maggie moved through her house like someone leaving forever, touching familiar objects as if memorizing them for the last time. "I can't do this," she whispered as they reached the front door, her face pale as paper in the darkness. "I can't leave. What if I have a panic attack? What if I collapse out there? What if—" "Hey!" Daniel knelt beside her, taking her cold hands in his calloused ones. "Tommy believed in you enough to trust you with the truth about his mother. He knew you were strong enough to handle whatever came next. And I believe in you too." Something in his voice, steady as bedrock, unwavering as a lighthouse beam, reached through Maggie's panic and found the part of her that had once been fearless. She looked into his eyes and found an anchor in the storm of her terror. They slipped out the back door just as heavy footsteps approached the front porch. Daniel's truck was parked 2 blocks away, hidden behind the Methodist church, where he'd left it when he realized they were being watched. As they hurried through the rain-soaked darkness, Maggie stumbled, overwhelmed by the vast open space around her after 8 months of walls and ceilings. Daniel caught her arm as she swayed. "Just focus on me," he murmured, his voice cutting through the panic that threatened to drown her. "One step at a time. You're doing great." They reached the truck just as police sirens wailed in the distance, heading toward Elm Street with their red and blue lights painting the wet pavement. Daniel started the engine with hands that trembled slightly, but as they pulled away from the curb, headlights flashed behind them like predator eyes in the darkness. The black sedan was following them, and this time Maggie could see that it wasn't Diane driving. Behind the wheel sat a man she recognized, Stevens, Diane's lawyer, his face grim with determination as he matched their speed through the empty streets of Maple Ridge. "Daniel," Maggie said, looking back through the rain-streaked rear window, "I think we're in more danger than we realized." 3 weeks later, the late afternoon sun painted Maggie's front porch in shades of gold and amber as the first snow of the season dusted the bare maple trees. She sat on the porch swing she'd been too afraid to use for 8 months, watching Daniel repair the loose board on her front steps with the patient concentration of a man who took pride in fixing things properly. "You know you don't have to keep repairing things around here," she said, with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time since Tommy's funeral. "I'm pretty sure I can afford to hire someone now." Daniel looked up from his work with a grin that transformed his weathered features. "Maybe I like having an excuse to stick around." The legal proceedings were finally over. Diane Patterson was awaiting trial in the county jail. The stolen money was being returned to the military families who needed it, and Maggie had been cleared of any question about her mental competency. More importantly, she'd been working with Dr. Hendricks on managing her agoraphobia and had made several successful trips into town, first to the police station, then to the courthouse, and finally to Rosa's restaurant for dinner. "I got a call from the school district today," Maggie said, her voice carrying a note of excitement Daniel hadn't heard before. "They offered me a position teaching 3rd grade. Part-time to start, with the possibility of full-time next fall. You going to take it?" Daniel asked, setting down his hammer and giving her his complete attention. "I think I am." She paused, studying his face in the golden light. "Tommy's letter said something else, you know. Something I didn't share with the police or the lawyers or anyone else." Daniel joined her on the porch swing, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and waited patiently for her to find the words. "He wrote that if something happened to him, he hoped I'd find someone who would love me the way I deserved to be loved. Someone patient and kind and steady." She turned to face him fully. "Someone who would help me find my way back to the world when I was ready." Daniel felt his heart skip like a stone across water. "And have you? Found your way back?" Maggie looked out at the street, where children were building the season's first snowman, at the neighbors who waved from their front yards, at the life she was slowly, carefully rejoining. Then she looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw not just the man who had delivered her food every evening, but the man who had helped deliver her back to herself. As the snowflakes began to fall more steadily, Maggie reached over and took Daniel's hand in hers. It was a simple gesture, but it represented everything. Trust earned through patience, hope nurtured through kindness, and the quiet courage that comes from knowing you're not alone in facing whatever tomorrow might bring. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel, subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments so you don't miss the next episodes. See you in the next story.